In this next segment, we sat down with State Senator Kristen Gonzalez to unpack the priorities around artificial intelligence at the state capitol. After passing legislation to limit the reliance on AI by state agencies, the senator is hoping to build on that work before the end of session. Here's that conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Senator.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Last year, you sponsored legislation that was signed and passed into law known as the Loading Act. Now, this law would essentially regulate artificial intelligence so that state agencies wouldn't be relying on it to make decisions. So can you tell us about the impetus of this legislation and how it works logistically?
That's a great question. So I chair the Senate Internet Technology Committee, and I'm also a former tech worker. So I've seen firsthand how our world is getting increasingly digital. And taking over the committee with the national conversation on artificial intelligence, it was a natural fit to be able to start regulating it at the state level. So the first thing we did was we passed a bill called the New York Fair Act, which regulated deepfakes in elections. And that was to protect, of course, our elections, but really our democracy. And naturally, if we're protecting our democracy, we also got to move and protect the public sector. So as these new tools are being adopted and as we have automated decision-making systems, and the final version of the bill that was signed into law at the end of last year is really focusing on employment decisions. So when our state agencies are using these automated tools to make decisions about employment, and it also focuses on protecting government workers. And that was something we worked on with the AFL-CIO and the Public Employees Federation, because as we're seeing today, protecting our government workers is critical to protecting our public sector, but again, protecting our democracy.
So what agencies would be charged with ensuring that state agencies are complying with the law? And what guardrails will be put in place to monitor these agencies?
That's another great question. So we do have a state agency, ITS, that's focused on the state's technical systems. And they do a variety of different things. They're a federated model, so there are teams embedded across other agencies. We also have a chief cybersecurity officer, so they work, in tandem to make sure that we're protecting our state's critical infrastructure. And that agency, prior to us passing this bill, actually put out a guidance on government use of AI. And so a lot of our bill was in line with the AI acceptable use policy, because it makes sense that the state's agency on technology would know what tools are being adopted, how they're being used, and have a clear audit and inventory of them. So our bill has that inventory, and I'm hoping to get the results next year and really see, how widespread these tools are.
Can you tell us about some of your other artificial intelligence priorities this year?
So we have a lot of AI priorities. I talked about regulating elections and ensuring that we're protecting our democracy. I talked about regulating the public sector, protecting our public sector. Naturally, we're moving to the private sector. We have the New York AI Act, which is an omnibus bill similar to Connecticut and Colorado's legislation on this, which helps put in place risk assessments and audits to make sure that these tools are being stewarded well and that they're not harming any New Yorkers. And on that same note, our chatbot liability bill aims to protect New Yorkers from some of the harms that we've already seen from these systems. So just for folks to know, a chatbot is essentially a large language model, which is what we call generative AI. And these large language models are a newer type of artificial intelligence. We use AI in social media. We've had it around for years and years, but generative AI is a little bit different because how it works is more similar to how the brain works, but it also means it's a black box. So when a chatbot is being prompted, or you're talking to it, for example, and it's giving you an output, there is no real way to explain why it's giving you that output or response that it's giving you. Whereas in other automated systems, you can look at the code, see what's going wrong, and fix it. So if we're going to have these systems that are black boxes, we need to make sure that if the outputs are harmful, and we've seen mental health be an issue. We actually had someone last year, a young man, kill himself as a result of interactions with a chatbot. We need to make sure that these companies understand the seriousness and responsibility they have when stewarding these tools, and we need to make sure that there is some liability. So our chatbot liability bill does this, And it also provides, the Attorney General's office with tools. It has a private right of action. So if someone's been harmed, they have a way to defend themselves. And we're hoping to get this passed this year.
And because artificial intelligence is pretty new, some of the risks are unknown. So I wanted to get your understanding of how you approach regulating such a new industry without impeding on some of its benefits.
We want to see innovation. We want to see technology continue to develop and grow. So we don't regulate the technology, we regulate the use cases. And the use cases, again, are how they're being applied in everyday life. And by doing that, we can make sure that our legislation is future-proof. We're focusing on the actual applications while giving the space for development. When we talk about chatbot liability or the New York AI Act, what we're also looking at are the highest risk use cases. So while all of the risks are unknown as new use cases come online, we do have some semblance of what the highest risk might be. And for us, that looks like anytime one of these systems is making a decision about our lives that can be really consequential. And consequential looks like a violation of our civil liberties, or something that decides our ability to get health insurance, our ability to get housing, our ability to access key benefits through any variety of providers. So we want to make sure that we're looking at the highest risk use cases, and we're continuing to engage everyone in this conversation, because we've already seen what happens when these tools are left onto their own devices. United Healthcare, for example, had a tool that had 90% of those decisions be overturned because they were incorrect. And that really hurt average people.
And when it comes to artificial intelligence, there seems to be a lot of conversation around, it potentially impeding on workers being able to work and artificial intelligence taking jobs away from New Yorkers. So what would you say to New Yorkers that are currently struggling with that fear?
We hear that a lot. I think as New Yorkers are seeing AI in the news every day, and they're hearing about the stories, whether it's United Healthcare or others, some of the negative use cases or applications, they're wondering, what does it mean for them? And when it comes to their job, what does it mean for the workforce? We're addressing that first part with our legislation. When it comes to workforce, we have to get a little bit more creative, because a single bill or regulatory framework isn't going to fix that. And while I think it's true that every sector is going to be touched by artificial intelligence, what doesn't have to be true is that we have mass layoffs, and that suddenly it's devastating not only our workforce or our tax system, right? What we can do is work together to train people at every level, whether you are in school, how to use these as a tool to be more productive, how to use AI in your role for the best of its abilities and the best of your capacity. People who are mid-career who want to transition and become more digital in their skill set. And we certainly are working to see what new jobs can be created. Because if we automate some, that can happen with new technology, but there may be new opportunities down the line. So we're looking to, upskill, we're looking to create new workforce development programs, and we're certainly investing as a state in these through, we talk about Empire AI, but really through our CUNY and SUNY schools.
And what are your current conversations like with labor advocates and the committee chairs of the labor committees in both chambers about ways that the states can protect New Yorkers?
We're certainly talking to labor unions. We worked with the AFL-CIO and Public Employees Federation, as I mentioned, on the Loading Act bill. We're continuing to engage them as we are introducing and working on the New York AI Act. And we're engaging a broader set of unions right now. How union members, depending on what the union membership looks like, will be touched by AI can be different. And we're talking to, whether it's teachers, nurses, otherwise, talking to those unions to see what their priorities are and how they might want their workers to be upskilled or protected. I think at a baseline, we need to ensure that this technology isn't impacting any collective bargaining agreements. That's why we saw that labor protection language in the Loading Act. But moving forward, it's not just engaging unions on this, it's how do we bring unions to the table, plus the private sector, plus our colleagues in the state legislature who chair the relevant committees, so that we actually have a holistic conversation, meeting people where they're at, that crafts a real path forward with this technology, but also a path that is representative of the New Yorkers who I know I'm here to serve, and my colleagues are certainly here to serve as well.
And as you mentioned, the state has already focused on elections when it comes to artificial intelligence. But what is your current read on the way that artificial intelligence may impact democracy?
So I also chair the Elections Committee in addition to the Internet and Technology Committee. And as I mentioned earlier, we had actually worked at the intersection of both last year when we passed our New York Fair Act. We focused on deepfakes first because during the presidential election, we saw multiple instances of deepfakes spreading misinformation. And I don't think that we're done. I think that misinformation is actually one of the biggest threats to our democracy. And, I mentioned AI being used in social media. Yes, that is true. And it's brought our democracy to the brink up until this point. But generative AI poses a threat on another level that we haven't seen. Generative AI creates content with an accuracy and human-like tendency that actually spreads misinformation with a quality we haven't seen before, but then on a scale we haven't seen before. These models are trained in so much more data and can also be leveraged to put out a lot more into, unfortunately, whether it's creating new AI sites that spread misinformation, responses on social media, in so many new ways. So we want to continue regulating. We want to continue protecting the integrity of our elections. And finally, we want to continue educating New Yorkers. People need to know how to spot a deepfake. They need to know how to spot a website that is completely fabricated. News sources like yours that are valid versus news sources that are spreading misinformation. And so we should not underestimate how critical that digital literacy piece will be, whether to our elections, but really to everything else that we're doing here in the legislature.
And how does New York stack up against other states in its approach to regulating artificial intelligence?
With regulating AI, I think we've led in some ways. We certainly, through this committee, have introduced new bills that go further than what other states have done. The New York AI Act, I think, is a great example of that because it takes what we've seen in other places, things like whistleblower protections, but it adds more. Instead of just a risk-based approach, we have a rights-based approach. We talk a lot about protecting people's fundamental civil liberties, and that's a way that we can lead here in New York. But there is always more work to do, and that's why we are excited to see the governor's office take this issue on. And we're excited to see so many of our colleagues in the legislature in both the Senate and Assembly who are excited to talk about this issue, introduce new bills, and we're hoping at the end of this legislative session to have an AI package that is another signal that New York is going to be leading on this instead of falling behind where we sometimes have in the past.
And that was State Senator Kristen Gonzalez, chair of the Senate Internet and Technology Committee. For more on those AI priorities, you can visit our website. That's at nynow.org.